The evening began with a kind of warmth that had long defined the Forrester gatherings, a carefully curated illusion of unity and legacy unfolding within the elegant walls of the estate, where generations of history seemed to linger in every polished surface and softly lit corner. And at the center of it all stood Eric Forrester, a man whose life had been built on creation, control, and the delicate art of holding together a family that had never truly stopped fracturing beneath its own emotional weight. Yet on this particular night, there was a subtle undercurrent that few could immediately identify, a tension that seemed to exist not in any single gesture or word but in the space between them, as though something unspoken had already entered the room long before anyone realized it. And as Donna Logan moved through the gathering with a brightness that bordered on deliberate, her smile just a shade too luminous, her movements slightly more measured than usual, it became clear that whatever was coming had been rehearsed internally, built up through moments of hesitation and resolve until it could no longer be contained, and when she finally reached for Eric's hand, drawing him gently but unmistakably into the center of attention, the shift in atmosphere was immediate, conversations faltering, laughter dissolving into silence. Every gaze turning toward her with a mixture of curiosity and anticipation, and in that suspended moment, the world seemed to narrow to the space between her words and their impact, because what she was about to say would not simply add to the evening but redefine it entirely. When Donna spoke, her voice carried a clarity that left no room for misinterpretation, an announcement delivered not as a possibility, but as a certainty that she was pregnant and that Eric was the father, and the effect was instantaneous and profound, a shockwave that rippled through the room, leaving behind a silence so dense it felt almost physical, as though the air itself had been displaced by the weight of what had just been revealed. And in that silence, the reactions began to emerge, subtle at first, then increasingly pronounced. The exchanged glances between Brooke Logan and Katie Logan carrying a shared disbelief that did not need to be spoken to be understood, a silent conversation rooted in history, in knowledge, in the kind of awareness that comes from years of witnessing the same patterns repeat themselves in different forms. And while Donna's expression remained steady, almost defiant in its certainty, the tension in the room began to coalesce around a single, unavoidable question. One that hovered just beneath the surface until it could no longer be ignored, because for Eric, the announcement did not simply come as a surprise but as a contradiction, a direct challenge to a reality he believed had been permanently altered by a decision made long ago. And as the memory of his vasectomy resurfaced with brutal clarity, his reaction was not immediate denial but something far more complex, a momentary paralysis where disbelief and fear collided, leaving him visibly shaken. His composure cracking just enough to reveal the depth of his internal turmoil, and it was in that moment that the illusion of control he had so carefully maintained began to unravel, drawing Donna aside, away from the scrutinizing eyes of the family. Eric's need for answers became urgent. Almost desperate, his questions not merely seeking clarification but attempting to reassert a sense of logic in a situation that defied it, and yet Donna's response, or rather her inability to provide one that satisfied the growing tension, only deepened the uncertainty. Her insistence that she was telling the truth clashing with the unspoken doubts that had already taken root in the minds of those around her, and as her composure began to falter under the weight of scrutiny, the emotional complexity of her position became more apparent. Because whether her claim was rooted in truth or deception, it was undeniably tied to a deeper need, a desire to secure her place within a family that had always been defined by shifting loyalties and fragile alliances, and in that sense, her announcement was not just about the possibility of a child but about identity, about belonging, about the lengths to which someone might go to preserve a connection that feels perpetually at risk of slipping away. Meanwhile, Brooke's response emerged with a force that cut through the lingering uncertainty, her skepticism transforming into confrontation as she articulated the question that everyone else had been circling, her words sharp with both logic and emotion as she challenged the feasibility of Donna's claim, bringing Eric's medical history into the open in a way that left little room for ambiguity, and in doing so, she shifted the dynamic from one of stunned disbelief to active interrogation, forcing the issue into the harsh light of scrutiny where it could no longer exist as an unexplained anomaly. And Katie, though more measured in her approach, was no less determined, her instincts driving her toward investigation, toward the gathering of facts that might either confirm or dismantle the narrative Donna was presenting. And as she began to consider the implications, the possibility that something far more calculated was at play began to take shape, suggesting that this was not merely a misunderstanding or an improbable event, but a potential deception with consequences that could ripple through every relationship in the room. As the tension escalated, the emotional landscape became increasingly fragmented, each individual navigating their own interpretation of the situation. Eric, caught between the woman he loved and the reality he could not reconcile, Donna struggling to maintain her position in the face of mounting doubt. Brooke and Katie driven by a need to uncover the truth, regardless of how painful it might be, and beneath it all, the unspoken understanding that whatever the outcome, the family would not emerge from this unchanged, because revelations of this magnitude do not simply resolve, they reshape. They redefine the boundaries of trust and loyalty in ways that cannot easily be undone, and it is within this charged atmosphere that the narrative takes a darker turn, as the external conflict is mirrored by a more insidious development, one that operates beyond the immediate confrontation, beyond the visible reactions, and enters the realm of secrecy and surveillance. When an anonymous message arrives on Brooke's phone, its presence almost understated in its simplicity, yet devastating in its implication, because within it lies an image, a captured moment that suggests a hidden truth. Donna meeting with an unidentified man, a detail that transforms suspicion into something more concrete, more dangerous, and as Brooke absorbs this new information, the weight of what it could mean begins to settle with a quiet but unmistakable intensity. Because this is no longer just a question of plausibility but of betrayal, not just between partners, but within the broader structure of the family itself. And in that moment, the narrative shifts once again, from confrontation to revelation, from uncertainty to the brink of exposure, leaving the characters suspended in a space where every assumption is about to be tested, every relationship about to be challenged, and the truth, whatever form it ultimately takes, poised to emerge with a force that will leave nothing untouched. The moment the image settles into Brooke Logan's vision, something inside her shifts with a clarity that borders on cold certainty, the kind of realization that does not explode outward but instead tightens inward, compressing emotion into something sharper, more dangerous, and far more controlled. Because this is no longer about suspicion or instinct, but about proof, about the quiet, undeniable confirmation that what stands before them is not simply an improbable situation but a carefully constructed illusion that is beginning to crack. And as she lifts her gaze from the phone, the room itself seems to transform, the warmth that had once defined the evening now replaced by an atmosphere thick with unspoken accusation, every glance carrying weight, every silence stretching longer than it should, and in that suspended tension, the dynamics between them begin to realign. Subtly but irrevocably, as the balance of power shifts away from Donna Logan and toward those who now hold a piece of truth she cannot yet control, Brooke does not speak immediately, and that restraint is more unsettling than any outburst could have been, because it suggests calculation, the careful consideration of how and when to reveal what she knows. And as Katie Logan notices the change in her sister's expression, the slight narrowing of her eyes, the tension in her posture, it becomes clear that something has shifted beneath the surface. Something that demands attention even before it is fully articulated, and when Brooke finally steps forward, her voice measured but unmistakably firm, the room seems to brace itself instinctively, as though aware that whatever comes next will dismantle what little stability remains. The image is not shown immediately to everyone, not yet, because Brooke understands the power of timing, the importance of allowing the weight of uncertainty to settle before introducing a revelation that will fracture the fragile narrative Donna has been trying to maintain, and instead, she begins with a question, deceptively simple yet loaded with implication, directed not just at Donna but at the entire room, asking how certain truths can exist simultaneously when they so clearly contradict one another, and it is in the way Donna reacts, the brief hesitation, the flicker of something unguarded in her eyes, that the first real crack appears, subtle yet undeniable, and for Eric Forrester, that moment is enough to deepen the unease that has been building within him, because doubt, once introduced, does not remain contained, it spreads. It infiltrates every assumption, every memory, every belief that once felt secure, and as he watches Donna struggle to maintain her composure, the realization that he may not fully understand the situation he is in begins to take hold with a quiet but devastating force. When the image is finally revealed, its impact is immediate and absolute, cutting through the tension with a precision that leaves no room for reinterpretation, because there is Donna, unmistakable, meeting with a man no one in the room recognizes, their proximity suggesting familiarity. Their interaction hinting at something concealed rather than innocent, and in that instant, the narrative shifts from uncertainty to confrontation, from questions to accusations, and the reactions that follow are as varied as they are intense. Katie's shock quickly transforming into determination as she begins to piece together the implications, Eric's confusion deepening into something more painful, a sense of betrayal that is not yet fully formed but already undeniable, and Donna herself, caught in the center of it all. Her carefully constructed certainty beginning to unravel as the reality of exposure settles in. What makes the moment particularly devastating is not simply the evidence itself, but the emotional context in which it emerges, because this is not a distant scandal or an abstract deception. This is a fracture within a family, a betrayal that touches not only romantic bonds but the deeper, more complex web of trust that has been built over years of shared history, and as the confrontation intensifies, the focus shifts from the image to its meaning, from what is seen to what it implies, and Donna's attempts to explain, to reframe, to hold on to the narrative she introduced, begin to falter under the weight of contradiction, her insistence on the truth of her pregnancy now overshadowed by the question of its origin, the possibility that what she presented as a miracle is in fact something far more calculated, far more deliberate. For Eric, the moment becomes one of profound internal conflict, because the woman he has loved, the woman he believed he understood, now stands before him as both familiar and entirely unknown, her tears no longer serving as reassurance, but as a reminder of how easily emotion can obscure truth. And as he demands an explanation, his voice carrying a mix of anger and disbelief, it becomes clear that this is not simply about the potential betrayal, but about the collapse of certainty itself, the realization that the foundation of his current happiness may have been built on something unstable, something that cannot withstand the scrutiny now being applied to it. Donna's response, when it comes, is not immediate or definitive, and that hesitation speaks louder than any words she might offer, because in that pause lies the acknowledgement of complexity, the admission that the truth is not as simple as she had presented it. And as she struggles to articulate a version of events that can reconcile the image with her claim, the emotional weight of the situation becomes almost unbearable, the room itself feeling smaller, more confined, as though there is no escape from the confrontation unfolding within it. At the edges of this conflict, the implications continue to expand, reaching beyond the immediate moment and into the broader dynamics of the family, because if Donna has deceived them, the question becomes not just why, but how far that deception extends, what other truths might be hidden beneath the surface, and whether the relationships that define them can withstand the impact of what is being revealed. And in this sense, the anonymous message becomes more than just a piece of evidence, it becomes a catalyst, a force that accelerates the unraveling of a narrative that was never as stable as it appeared. As the confrontation reaches its peak, the emotional lines are drawn more clearly than ever before, Brooke and Katie standing not just as skeptics, but as protectors of a truth that must be uncovered, Eric caught between his love for Donna and his need for honesty, and Donna herself, isolated within the very space she had hoped to secure, her vulnerability now exposed in a way that leaves her with few options and even fewer allies, and it is in this moment of complete exposure that the story finds its most compelling tension. Not in the certainty of what will happen next, but in the uncertainty of how far the consequences will reach, because in a world where truth and deception are so tightly intertwined, the act of revealing one inevitably reshapes the other, leaving behind a reality that is both clearer and